Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here at Thomas Balch Library for a very exciting panel that we have today on the book Between Freedom and Equality. We're very excited to have the authors with us, Barbara Boyle Torrey and Clara Myrick, who goes by Tiggy, so you will hear us referring to her as that today. We are very excited to have them with us, and hopefully we'll be joined by James Fisher, one of the family members. So I am going to waste no time. I'm going to hand it right over to the authors so we can hear about the incredible journey that they took to get this book to us. And this is quite the journey, so I'm going to let you guys tell us all about it.
Great. Thank you so much. This is really fun for us. This is a story about an extraordinary African-American man named George Poynter. He was born a slave in the 18th century, but he rose to become a supervisory engineer for the Potomac Canal Company that was run by George Washington. In doing a local history, we found a reference to a letter this man had written. And the next time we went to the National Archives, we looked the letter up. And the letter was simply in a very simple, unpretentious manila folder. And it was just waiting to be read. We were struck by the letter of this former slave. He has handwriting better than either one of us. He had his English and his organization of his story was forthright, clear, and he would have been a star in any English class. We were so intrigued by him that we wanted to learn more. We had no agenda. We were just really interested in him. And the Potomac Canal Company actually had a number of references to him. And he bought his freedom when he was 19 years old, and therefore he and his descendants were in every decennial census after that. So the census has really built a scaffolding for us that we could begin to flesh out the story of him and his descendants. Anyone who's worked with the censuses knows that it's not enough. We really needed a lot more information, and the historical societies in Great Falls, Montgomery County, the DC and Maryland historical societies were invaluable in terms of beginning to tell a more detailed story on this. It has taken us 13 years. We were a little horrified when we went back to find out how long we had done this. But we actually, over those 13 years, found 43, actually, and even more, of his descendants over 6 generations itself. We didn't know where the story was going, and we didn't know when it would end. We were just actually doing it out of curiosity initially. Only after we got the first draft of the history done did we then go back and look and realize of some of the themes that were not obvious when you work forward in a history like this. And I will actually go through those themes and show you what we found that was so important for this family. I will briefly summarize the themes, and then I'm going to hand it over to Tiggy to talk about sort of the keystone person in this history who links the first generation, the sixth generation together. We're hoping that James Fisher is going to join us because he's the eighth generation of George Poynter and has a unique story all of his own to tell. Let me begin with the first theme that we slowly discovered. I wouldn't say it was sitting there in plain sight. It was how fragile the African American freedom was in the slave states before the Civil War. We had not realized, well, there were so few. In Maryland, when George Poynter bought his freedom, there were only 2.5% of all African Americans were freed at the time. And therefore, it was logical that you would assume that any African American you met was a slave. And that was the context for the fragility of their lives. There were ridiculous prohibitions on them. They couldn't have a dog without permission. They couldn't have a gun without permission. They couldn't actually meet together without having a white person there. They were, if they didn't have if people didn't know that they were freed, they always risked the chance of being kidnapped and then resold. And this was, they required, the Maryland at the time required all freed slaves to carry certificates of freedom. And if you didn't have one, you were then vulnerable to being resold. The interesting thing about the certificate of freedom was it had to be issued by a judge, and it needed, you couldn't use black witnesses, you had to use white witnesses. And what was very interesting in this story was that we found several of the certificates of freedom, and the witnesses, the white witnesses on them, actually retold part of our story because we were so surprised at who they were, and then we had to go back and rethink some of the things that we had seen before. The second thing was, however, that despite the fragility of the freed African Americans, the Poynter families lived in remarkably stable communities. And we were surprised. The George Poynter and then his son's family lived in their cottage at Little Falls on the Maryland side of the Potomac for almost 60 years. And we can see them in the censuses, often with the same neighbors, from decade to decade. George Poynter and his wife, Elizabeth, raised their granddaughter from one of their daughters who disappears in the records. But they raised their granddaughter, and in fact, she then, who is the capstone person in this story, eventually she and her husband buy a 2-acre farm in Chevy Chase, DC, and they and their descendants lived there for 80 years. The most interesting thing about working with the census records is that you can see, with the original census records, is that you can see the neighbors next to each household, so that you can tell whether they, the characteristics of the neighborhood. Neighborhood's not quite the right word, but it's the people who are living proximate to each other. And what we were surprised at is how many of these neighborhoods throughout the 6 generations had, in fact, white neighbors. And it didn't mean, obviously, that there was no racism. Of course there was. But it did mean that the children played together. And we have several incidences of people remembering playing with the white children, or the white children remembering them. The other thing is the adults, obviously, especially, in the 19th century, if you're neighbors, we're going to take care of each other and help each other. And we have several incidences of that also. It didn't mean that things were fine in the 19th century. But it was a curious mix that we often do not see in the 20th century. I give you a sense, when we were looking back through these generations, of how they were all affected by the racism of their time, and how the racism shifted, and how it shifted its effects on them itself. We were interested because you could see it reflected in the lives of these families. The first one was in the end of the 18th century. The Haitian Revolution really put terror into the white population of the United States at the time. It was very violent. It was a number of white people were murdered, and it was one of the impetuses, actually, of the prohibition of the slave trade in 1808. But what that meant was that if they couldn't import more slaves, and they were so starved for labor at the beginning of the 19th century, it put a premium on the slaves that were already here, and which is why you had some of the kidnapping and trading in the South, which would have been a context for all of the people in our history itself. But I think it was Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831 that had the most immediate effect in Maryland, Virginia, and DC, obviously. And he actually had this the slaughtering of the white people during this rebellion was so gruesome, and that the white populations suddenly realized the huge threat that their slave and free black population really posed to them. And in fact, there had been colonization societies in Virginia, Maryland, and in DC, starting really years before, but Nat Turner's rebellion really gave impetus to the colonization, exporting of free Black people to Liberia. And in fact, the Maryland legislature funded their colonization society because they wanted all of the free Blacks to be exported. And George Poynter's daughter, first daughter, appeared on one of the lists. They made an itemized list of all the free Blacks in Maryland at the time. We could not find any. We could not find her on any of the lists of people who were actually shipped. We only found her on the potential list itself. What happened after Turner, a few years after Turner's rebellion, DC exploded in a race riots in downtown DC, and that is likely the impetus for George Poynter's granddaughter and her husband of getting out of downtown DC, where a number of Blacks had been killed. And they moved out into what was a very rural part of the District of Columbia, called Washington County, in fact. And they eventually bought a farm out there. 30 years after, and you can see both in the effects on this family itself, that the race relations were becoming worse and worse after Nat Turner's. And 30 years afterwards, of course, was the outbreak of the Civil War. Civil War was very important in DC in particular, and Virginia. Two of George Poynter's great-grandsons fought in the Civil War, and the Confederate troops actually invaded the farm, 2-acre farm of George Poynter's granddaughter, which was in Chevy Chase. Anyway, Tiggy will pick up that story, and we'll go on after that.
Okay. I thought I'd talk a little bit. You might want to hear a little bit about more about the descendants and particularly the ones on the granddaughter's farm. We were able to find out quite a bit about that family, and then of course their descendants. The granddaughter and her husband had 8 children in a 19-year span of time in the beginning, about 1839, but only 5 of those children survived into adulthood. There were 4 sons, and the youngest one was a daughter. One document, it was a census document actually, that touched us quite a lot. It was a census document that had recorded deaths in Washington, D.C. in 1850. And we found the tragic record of the couple's 9-year-old daughter, Mary, who died of burns within a 24-hour period. It's sort of devastating to see this document. It brought home how easily children died. 2 other children actually in the family disappeared from the records after the Civil War. So perhaps there were a lot of epidemics at the time. So they succumbed to something. All the children grew up on the family farm called Dry Meadows. It had a name that was recorded in a variety of documents. And some of the next generation also grew up there. We learned about their lives through, as Barbara said, through censuses, but other documents, directories, military records, even maps. a variety of legal documents. And we realized that they're stable, as Barbara mentioned, they had a stable upbringing, the children did, in this family-owned property. And it made a difference in their lives, in the success of their lives. And through the generations, family members kept in close contact with each other and remained friends with their neighbors. Barbara pointed out we found several instances where there were neighbors helped one another, both Black and white. We learned the Civil War affected the family very directly. In 1863, as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation, the federal government finally permitted Black men to fight for the Union under federal control. And the government created what was called the U.S. Colored Troops, or USCT. And the two eldest sons, as Barbara noted, enlisted immediately in July of 63. It was quite a decision on their part. They were, young, but the Confederacy had announced that they would send into slavery any Black soldier captured and taken prisoner. And in fact, what did happen, many times captured Black soldiers were killed by rebels. At any rate, the two brothers enlisted and trained on, they were in the first regiment that was formed in the district, and they trained on an island right opposite the port of Georgetown, right in the Potomac River. It was a bit away from people who had prejudice against the idea of having Black soldiers. It was a bit isolated. They weren't treated the same way as white soldiers. For instance, they were paid less than their white counterparts, and they weren't allowed to hold a rank above sergeant. Excuse me. So all their officers were white. And after only a few weeks of training, this first regiment was sent off to fight in North Carolina and then later in Virginia. And the men proved their worth time after time in battles, in face of all the prejudice they had faced. A year later, in 1864, Barbara mentioned how the district itself was attacked by rebel soldiers. They invaded from Maryland, from the north, and the Poynter's granddaughter's farm was endangered. It was right in the path of the troops who were headed toward Fort Stevens, and that fort was just 2 miles to the east of the family's farm. And the maps even show a line of skirmishes right exactly in between the soldiers, right where the farm was located. Residents had to flee the area because these rebels were burning homes and barns and crops and stealing cattle. And it was a very dangerous situation, and they fled toward the city. And you can imagine how frightening that would have been for this family, the granddaughter's family. She had 3 children at home. The youngest one was 6. But a few days later, the rebels retreated, and people were able to return to their homes and assess whatever damage there was. During the war, both sons who were fighting were hospitalized at different times, one from a serious wound and one from a lengthy illness. And the younger of the two was the one that was hospitalized for a long time. And as a result of this lengthy time in the hospital, he became literate and was the first one of the family to do so. At the end of the war, his literacy enabled him to go to New York, to travel to New York City and find work. And eventually he became a Pullman porter, which he made his life's job, his career. His veteran brother, returned home and then immediately went into the port of Georgetown. And he found steady employment, as he was not educated, but he found steady employment as a laborer. And his family always remained in the same address. It was a thriving Black neighborhood on the eastern edge of the port, right near the city of Washington, along Rock Creek, which was a very advantageous place to live. And his son, his only son, would become a civil servant and work at the post office. And the son, would himself buy a home in that same area where his parents lived, and would have a thriving career and support his mother once his father died. The other boys that were at home, the next younger one, who had to flee into the city with his parents, came to Georgetown looking for a job. By then he was about 18, and he found a job as a driver in the port, which it's an important job because there were always materials coming in and out of the port. And they settled in. He had a family, and he settled in another neighborhood that was primarily Black residents, not far from the Georgetown College campus. And they lived there for 10 years until they were forced to move when the government bought the land in the area to build a school. They stayed in Georgetown, but had to move several times over the years. But the brothers remained close. Two sons of the two brothers' sons would go back to the family farm in what is now Chevy Chase and help the grandparents doing farm chores. So the connections were always very stable. After the war, the two youngest children on the farm were still living with their parents, and they were able to go to school for the first time because with Reconstruction came a new little one-room school not too far from where they were living. And it made a difference in their lives, particularly in the life of the youngest son. Like his brothers, he went to Georgetown to find work as well, but because of his literacy, he was able to get a job as a sexton at a Episcopal church in Georgetown, which is a building manager. And he remained at St. John's Episcopal Church there in Georgetown for 10 years, and then got a promotion to the Episcopal Cathedral in Buffalo, New York. And he went there and spent the rest of his life, he bought a home there with his wife, and they lived out their lives in Buffalo. He remained connected to his family. He would return and visit them. We found evidence of that in newspapers. And he remained a board member on a local Black benevolence society, the Moses Society. And on his death, he and his wife left their home to one of his nieces, his youngest sister's, his sister's daughter. Literacy made a difference in the lives of the men in their work lives. For the women, they usually had jobs the women of the family usually has jobs as maids or doing laundry. And this was true for the youngest daughter who'd grown up on the farm, and she always remained there. She married a shoemaker. She created a very stable family life, and she and her husband brought up their children on the farm. The 4 children went to the same school that she had attended. And eventually, once the children were married and they were older, they would move to a nearby Fort Reno neighborhood, which was a primarily Black neighborhood, where there was a new school had been built in 1903 called the Jesse Reno School. And so their children had a better school to attend. The daughter's 2 sons would have successful careers, one as a gardener in one of the DC parks, and the other as a very successful funeral director. Of course, change came, development came to the rural area of DC, and with the improvement of transportation, you had electric streetcars, and they would bring city dwellers out to the countryside, and it wouldn't take long for developers to take an interest in the land. In the 1890s, real estate barons like Francis Newlands were buying up large tracts of farmland there, both in Maryland and in DC. And at the turn of the century, if you look at a map from 1903, we could see there were a few large tracts of farmland, a few left, but all around were small lots being developed. And by 1925, the settlement where Dry Meadows was, that had been the home of the granddaughter and then her daughter, was complete. That and their few neighbors, the black settlement was completely surrounded by small lots where houses were being built. As the lots were developed and white families moved into the new homes, the need for schools became evident. And in cooperation with the developer and the banks, the DC government chose the property of the black settlement on Broad Branch Road to build a school. And it used the power of eminent domain to obtain the property. And thus all the black residents were forced to sell their homes. The deeds to these newly developed properties had racially restrictive covenants, and black people could not buy homes in them to remain in the area. They couldn't do that. And that fixed the segregation that Barbara was talking about in the 20th century. And it was in 1928 that the Poynter's great granddaughter had to sell the last parcel of the Dry Meadows farm. It had been home to 3 generations in a period of almost 80 years. It was interesting, between 1885 and 1928, the use of eminent domain by the government in order to build schools in particular affected 4 Poynter descendants in 3 generations. You have the Duke Ellington School in Georgetown, Lafayette Elementary School in Chevy Chase, Alice Steele Middle School, and Wilson High School in the Tenleytown area. All were on land that had once been occupied by Poynter descendants. And of course, the displacement of those black families made the neighborhoods more segregated than they had been in the 18th and 19th century. So the story of George Poynter and his descendants was revealed to us little by little over a long time, as Barbara mentioned, and we didn't immediately find his present-day descendants. And the discovery of James Fisher, the Poynter's 5th great-grandson, along with his partner, genealogist Tanya Hardy, came as a fantastic surprise. And it was the result of all our work with Ancestry.com. They were doing research on his family histories starting in the 20th century and looking to the past. And we were doing the opposite direction. We were starting in the 18th century and heading toward the present. And James is here, and he's going to tell you about our meeting and what he and Tanya have done to preserve the history of George Poynter and his descendants, working with the historians at Great Falls Park in Virginia, as well as the historic Chevy Chase Society in DC. They've done some extraordinary things. So I think I'll end there, and James can discuss. Hi there.
Oh, hello. I'm sorry I'm late. My alarm clock didn't go off, so of course I stayed under the covers. I sleep. So I'm really sorry. I'm a late arrival here. This means so much to me.
James, tell us about your when Tanya told you that somebody knew somebody in your family in the 18th century. What was your reaction to that?
Well, Tanya didn't tell me that. You both did. I looked for the email. I was excited to tell her that I received the email. She may have received something too, but I was to communicate to her that I received an email from you both. And it just said that, you both had been looking for my family, me and my family, a while. And you were pretty sure that my family tree that you had located on
Ancestry, yeah.
yes. In fact, I was the family, and did I know that I had a famous ancestral grandfather?
Mm-hmm.
So I read it about 6 times, wondering if it was a prank, et cetera. And then I communicated with Tanya, and she pretty much took it from there in communicating, and up to our first meeting. So that was very exciting. It was like going through a time warp because we both, Tanya and I, we researched and we went back maybe 2.5 generations before we took a break, and we started researching my family, my father's side of the family. We went back into the 1700s with my father's family fairly quickly, less than maybe a week and a half. And then we started back on my mother's side. And of course, you shared so much information with me. I really didn't have time to consume it all in that space of time, as well as the many accomplishments of my ancestral family. So I was overwhelmed. I was proud.
Mm-hmm.
Especially me, because I was very skeptical. I didn't believe I would go back more than 3 generations. And they accomplished so much, and I was just overwhelmed by it. And also, too, my feelings were mixed. First, pride, above all else, but to learn how different people knew who they were, and wanted to keep it hidden. Quickly put a damper on my amazement with my family, and anger at the different establishments and people who chose to keep a damper on my family's accomplishments.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I'm still trying to adjust to that.
I know.
Can you tell about the family reunion you had?
Yes, that brought our family together because all the information that I was putting out to the family, you were putting to me, I was putting out to the family, and the things that we were discovering. I was extremely proud of them. I shared this with the family and extended family, and I came up with the idea of a family reunion, and have it at the ancestral Lafayette Park, or Lafayette Poynter Park now. So that came together in 2015. We had a wonderful time. We had some people coming in from, different states, but not many, because I would say more than 85% of my family remained in the general Washington, Maryland, Virginia area. I found that incredible as well. We just had a full day of fun, and some of the neighbors, thought we were out of place. Oh yes, they thought we were out of place. They didn't know the history. They didn't know that Black people did once own that land, because they were told that it was, it had always been a vacant lot.
Yeah.
So the few that straggled by and asked questions, we were glad to share that with them. So,
James, this is Nora at the Balch. Did any of your relatives know about the history of Captain George Poynter when you shared it with them? Or were were they excited to learn of that history?
I'm sorry, who didn't? I'm sorry, ask me the question again.
When you were speaking with the relatives and when you got together for the reunion and you were sharing this information that Barbara and Tiggy had shared with you about George Poynter, did any of your relatives know this history already about the family, or were they learning it when you shared it with them?
Oh no, not at all. Nobody knew. None of them knew our history, because we were like broken up into camps, and a lot of my families, the different branches, were in survival mode most of their lives. So to have the time to actually learn about our history, that would have been marvelous if we had the time. So, but we didn't really have the time or the interest. We were on survival mode.
And you've done a lot of work since learning about Captain George Poynter and the family history to make sure that everyone knows about him. Can you share a little bit about that?
Oh, well, Tiggy and Barbara, they were doing their thing. And I mean, Tanya, we were doing our thing. She would drag me to, libraries, graveyards. So she was always ready to go. I didn't give her much of a problem, but she asked me twice instead of once. It's just, it wasn't my thing. But once I would get in the library or in a place to do the research, I did add to. I did find some things, and I proved to be a good assistant.
But you also, James, were instrumental in getting the George Poynter panorama at the Great Falls National Park Museum to identify George Poynter, and you also got Poynter's name on the park, the school park.
Those are a couple of things that
Yeah.
The people felt my anger, and up at Great Falls, they felt my anger when I questioned them about them having a exhibit at Great Falls for 10 years, and knowing who the statue was, but neglecting to leave his name off of the exhibit or anything about his life. Management there did not have they didn't have an answer. They were just silent. So, we did meet as a group, and we ironed out what we wanted, and that worked out. We tried to safeguard George Poynter's cabin area. I failed to do that, and that's a great defeat. I'll tell you, I wasn't emotionally prepared to have such a successful ancestral family, and one that wasn't or haven't been recognized by history intentionally in some cases. So I've been very emotional about it. Even when I think about it, my body starts shaking. I wouldn't have it any other way other than not to have these kind of petty barriers still in the way, wanting to keep Black history suppressed and accomplishments. But we fight on. We fight on.
James, are you working on anything right now for your ancestor?
Well, I understand UDC students have slowed down, but they're working on as a reparation to take ownership of the property once again that was taken in the domain. So I'm still active with that, and any other thing that may arise, to get the word out about the accomplishments of my ancestral family. So I just stand ready.
And you're doing a phenomenal job of that, James. We're very thankful to have you with us today. If anyone has any questions for James or Barbara or Tiggy, please put them in the chat. We do have some questions that have come in today already. For Barbara and Tiggy, did you find any correspondence that was specifically between George Poynter and George Washington?
No, we did not. George Poynter in his letter describes George Washington periodically coming out to visit the sites where he was working and giving money. I think he said a silver dollar to each work group, so that everybody looked forward to his visits, but we don't have anything specific about it. And I went through George Washington's diaries and I couldn't find anything.
Well, if I may add, he mentions giving $1 to the labor force. He does not mention himself. So, given that he was a Black man and that he had a supervisory role, I'm quite sure George Washington knew who he was, as well as some of the dignitaries, because at that time, Black men or Black people weren't supposed to be able to do what George Poynter did, and be such an asset to his company. So George Washington definitely knew who George Poynter was and how much an asset he was to his company, as well as others in Washington. He was talked about.
Barbara and Tiggy, in doing this research of George Poynter and his descendants, did it change your understanding of American history at all? And if so, how?
So much.
Yeah.
First of all, I'm old enough so that my education was, you never spoke of African Americans' role in American history, which was huge. And so all of a sudden, we were able to, when we looked at the context of when this family was living over a period of time, it became clear how they were affected by so many events, usually negatively, and then all that they accomplished in spite of those things. Just reading about the USCT, the Black troops, and how they were mistreated, it was just a revelation. So that so many things you look at now, you can look at the Civil War, remembering how many of those Black men, some of whom had been enslaved, were fighting for any event you can now look at. It made me look at history differently and want to know more.
It's very interesting because what we have now is our American history is told from a specific point of view. And it's not wrong. It's just that it's conscribed. And what we need to be able to do is to broaden our history to provide this broader perspective. And we really felt it. We would be working on something and saying, oh my heavens, can you believe? Something that we had always known, but we had never seen it from another perspective.
I'd like to make a comment. It was incomplete. It was, major parts of it is omitted. It is wrong. It's not right. It's not wrong. It is wrong.
Yeah. You need to tell the story in a much broader framework.
Full story. We've never had that.
Yeah.
We've been referring to George Poynter as Captain George Poynter. Can you discuss whether he received that by serving in the military or how he came to be referred to as captain?
He refers to himself as captain. He was not in the military, but they called people who were working on the river captain periodically over time, and he owned a boat. He was well known on the river, and so I think probably people started calling him that, and he then began referring to himself that way. But it was not because of the military.
Well, if I may add also that it was not unusual for quite a few Black men, slaves, free men, otherwise, made a living off of rivers, even in upper different parts of Virginia, way out. And I was surprised when I was taking a trip somewhere and went to a center that was open to a park, and to see a Black man on riverboats making a living. So, that kind of tuned me into, the understanding that, quite a few Black men made a living off of the river, and they would call themselves captain if they were experts on that river. And people followed. If you were extremely good, and and you did it for a while, you had that experience, you call yourself, a captain. And given that he had a vast amount of experience on the river, he was naturally captain, as well as the company directing him to take charge of their fleet of riverboats. So he had those responsibilities in the company as well. So he had a crew that he on the river. So I guess
he also was the he participated in the first formal survey of the Potomac River in 1786, I think it was. And so he knew this river better than anybody else who was alive in the 19th century. It's quite interesting. And we went back and looked at all the notes of the survey, and it's very detailed, and as you would expect. So he was actually probably one of the leading experts on the entire Potomac River.
The respect he was held in respect even in the company records, and we found an instance, for instance, referring to, we will have Mr. Poynter do such and such, and he at the time he was quite young when they, so he was held in respect even by these folks that were keeping the records.
Was he part of the Potomac project until the completion of the river? How involved was it? I know that you weren't able to find an actual death record for him, so
no,
an idea of when he passed is rough. But how long was he involved in the river project?
Oh, he looks to us like he must have been the longest term employee,
And the last.
And the last. He was he probably died in 1832 with the cholera epidemic at the time. And the only reason we say that is because a doctor in DC talking about the cholera epidemic said that it was unusually virulent on the free black, the well-known free black population living along the Potomac. And the fact that he was being called captain means that it probably was.
Well, if I can put two more cents in here, we found that he was one of the first people hired. I believe they had a robbery at the gunpowder mill not long after the company was formed. So I believe they hired, one of his first duties was to guard the gunpowder. So that's very close to actually the formation of the company.
Right. Yep.
The last monies that the company dispensed was to George Poynter. He had they asked him to clean the river just before the CNO took over. So he was one of the first and one of the last employees, if not the last employees of the company, last employer of the company. So he was there.
Yeah.
Barbara and Tiggy, one of the favorite questions people like to ask is, what are you working on now? What's next?
We're trying to get this story out.
Making meals for our husbands, yes.
Yes, I hear they're very excited to have you back.
This is, we really want to publicize this story. This is an important story. And the book I think has been well received on this. You have a question about the book, and we actually wrote the book so that we have some sense of wanting to do more with this, to be sure that it's taken. I feel I really want it to be used by school children. This is where we need to be pushing American history to broaden this context on it.
A student in junior high could be assigned, or high school could be assigned or choose a person different from him or herself, and find out about that person. You know, another aspect of history. We've talked about that. You know, find your own George Poynter, or
Right.
what it is.
On that topic, there's been a lot of trend lately to take very well researched history books such as Between Freedom and Equality and make a youth version so that elementary age children can get exposed to the story. Have you thought of doing that with George Poynter's story?
No, yeah, we're probably not the right people. But we would love to work with anybody who wanted to take this on. I think that's sort of the next stage.
Well, if I might add, when Tanya and I and the crew was working with the I forget, I'm sorry. We was working with the where exhibit is at.
Park Service, the Park Service.
Park Service, yes. We talked about developing pamphlets for, you know, the children about George Poynter, so and different things. So we put part of it together, and then we kind of lost communications with the Park Service. They took it and went somewhere else with it or whatever. They may have the handouts. They may have done that. I haven't been communicating with them, but we saw drafts of it. There's a lot of stories in there for both children, wonderful stories for both children and adults. He was a great man, and he was moral, and just reading about his life, you know, those short pages, wasn't very long. You get a pretty good understanding of who George Poynter was. He's a story for everyone. So Tanya and I was talking about, you know, children's book, but that could very well be in the future. So we just keep getting the words out. I hope his story is told in as many museums as possible, in every media network or whatever, to keep getting the word out. Is a wonderful story of a great man. It's unique because I don't believe there's any other story told extending that far back. Of course, not about a enslaved Black because of the lack of information, but of a free family covering, you know, so many generations. That'll be a hard find. So, you know, for those who are sincere and really want to learn, because I have, you know, I run into Caucasians often saying, well, they don't know about Black people. Well, this is in-depth research. This is if they're really serious and they really want to know about the journey of, Black people in America, historically to present. The book is out there. They have good research, excellent research, and it's just wonderful. It's like I said, it's one of a kind.
I think those are some great thoughts to end this event with. So I would like to thank Barbara and Tiggy and James for joining us today. Thank everyone else for attending, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thank you so much for attending this Thomas Balch Library event, and we hope you will join us for others. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you so much.
Here.
Thank you.